मैं पीवी नरसिम्हा राव
ईश्वर की शपथ लेता हूँगी
ईश्वर की शपथ लेता हूँ कि
The swearing in of the Narasimha Rao government was under tragic circumstances. The Congress party had just lost its supreme leader Rajiv Gandhi in a brutal assassination, and the country was still recovering from two short-lived opposition governments which had pushed it into a caste cauldron.
It was a situation when I think people were quite tired of the feeling of instability, which had undermined also the authority of government, and people looked forward to a long stretch of Congress rule.
Although Rao's party had won the general elections, Narasimha Rao was in effect heading a minority government. Since it was the force of circumstances alone which had catapulted Rao to the top post, nobody had any expectations from him.
We arrived in a state of utter confusion. Nothing really was expected. Our first understanding of what we had in front of us was astonishing, was shocking.
Even as people speculated about his survival, the stopgap Prime Minister of a minority government settled down to begin his work in right earnest. Today, after almost 2 years, the government headed by Narasimha Rao has succeeded in turning conventional wisdom on its head. Not only has the government survived, but it has also achieved a surprising degree of success.
We have started a rethink about management of governments, about management of countries, what a modern country and a modern management and a modern government are. These are the things that we've started thinking about, debating, and at different levels implementing. So all the talk about a leap into the 21st century has begun to take root, as it were, in these 2 years.
A situation where the reserves are almost $7 billion. We're very far from the period 2 years ago when we weren't sure how we were going to be able to meet our payments. International confidence has been restored. People are taking a look at India. Impression is gaining ground that India is open for business.
Such was the impact of the new fiscal culture being introduced by the Rao Singh team that within the party, policies rather than personalities came into sharp focus.
An atmosphere has been created where people are prepared to act. In fact, the rationale of reform measures are that it creates conducive atmosphere for the major players, industry, government, people, to respond to the changing situation and act. That atmosphere has been created, and I do hope the players would take advantage of it and would act.
On the domestic political plane, he had an unenviable legacy in the Punjab and Kashmir problems. Displaying his faith in the high degree of resilience in India's democracy, Rao persevered with the elections in Punjab, and today, without any fear, once again, the strife-torn state celebrates all its festivals in full colors.
People are fed up with this and were no longer taken in by these false notions of and false propaganda of the neglect of Punjab, which had never been the case. So it was the right time to inject a democratic process again.
But it was the Ayodhya issue which was to become the most potent test of Narasimha Rao's government. It was an issue which polarized the country and gave the country's image a battering in the international press.
An impression is sought to be created that there's chaos. Of course, they must be very disappointed that Bombay bounces back in 24 hours and is back at work. They must be surprised that what they thought would break the fabric of Indian society after Ayodhya didn't happen. They would be surprised that, communities are still living together as friends. And that, in that sense, I think it's not a setback, it's a test. I think it's a greater challenge to ensure that we continue in what we have resolved to do.
Within the party, Rao sought to galvanize the Congress by holding organizational elections at the Tirupati AICC session. This was acclaimed by the grassroots level partymen and helped Rao to strengthen his roots.
After many years, I stand to be corrected, but I think 20 or 25 years, the Congress party had internal party elections successfully completed. There may have been many flaws along the way. There may have been many things could have been improved upon. But the elections did take place, and this was an important message also.
But it was in the Surajkund AICC session in March 1993 where Narasimha Rao consolidated his position.
I request our friends, all of you, to make this distinction. Do not cross the line, the Lakshman Rekha, beyond which dissent becomes counterproductive.
Although dissidents had reared their head and efforts were made to replace him as party president, the dissidents were soon marginalized. Congressmen and party members reaffirmed their full faith in his leadership. There was no doubt that although the number 2 position in the Congress party was up for grabs, at least for the time being, the number 1 position was firmly in the grasp of Narasimha Rao.
That is the tradition of this Congress party. Congress party has all along been headed by a leader since its inception.
Narasimha Rao is in total command of the entire situation, both in the party and as Prime Minister.
In the field of foreign affairs, successful visits by John Major, Boris Yeltsin and Helmut Kohl have boosted India's image. After the Bombay blasts, Pakistan has been isolated for harboring terrorists and promoting terrorism in the international arena. The moves by USA to declare Pakistan as a terrorist state justified India's allegations that both the Kashmir and Punjab problems have been accentuated by help from across the border.
Our point of view is beginning to get accepted much more in bilateral talks and multilateral forums, and it's suddenly become important to think of what India is saying. People are running to us on issues, whether they come from one end or they come from the other end, but India has in a sense become pivotal.
After 2 years of much-needed political stability and economic reforms, the Rao government enters its most decisive phase. Although economic restructuring is the most potent political weapon for Rao, ultimately he will have to face the realism of India's domestic politics, today quite unmistakably colored in sectarian and communal overtones. How successful he will be in tackling these anti-secular and parochial forces will determine how the future will judge the Narasimha Rao government.
There was a measure of desperation when Narasimha Rao took over the reins of the country. The economy was in tatters. Budgetary deficit had reached unmanageable proportions. Inflation was raging at 16 to 17%, while domestic production growth languished at 1.2%. And the country's pride had been mortgaged along with its reserve gold to tide over the foreign exchange crisis. The Gulf War and the disintegration of the USSR had affected exports, and only fresh loans from the IMF and World Bank could salvage the situation. Although there were criticisms on the conditions set by IMF and World Bank before sanctioning the loans.
It's not correct to say that the institutions lay down conditionalities. We looked at the situation, we worked out our own reform program, and then we went to the institutions saying, this is our reform program. Are you prepared to support it? Now that's what these institutions are there for. That's why we are members of the institutions. And we have borrowed from the IMF in the 1970s, we've borrowed from the IMF in the 1980s, and I don't see any reason why we shouldn't borrow from the IMF in the 1990s if we need to.
But for most political realists, any bailout from the IMF would at best be a short-term measure. Analysts had long predicted that India's economy needed a very major structural overhauling, an ideological cleansing if it was to be integrated into the world market.
It is in a sense departure from the past, because we have been tied down to a kind of ideology which was a sort of half-baked socialist ideology, but which we felt was necessary. Today we have the confidence to say, yes, it will be the market will deliver, private services, private sector will deliver. Our confidence that we can go through with this.
There is a conceptual change. It is not merely to overcome the crisis and to bridge the gap, whatever was available from the multilateral or institutional agencies, and to get it from other sources. There is a recognition that perhaps to have direct flow of equity in the areas of investment where we don't have adequate resources to invest would be a better way of not only managing the BOP situation but also to get resources for funding the developmental projects.
Backed by a party manifesto committed to economic liberalization, the first signals from the Narasimha Rao team was positive. Manmohan Singh, now an ardent supporter of the free market economy, was made finance minister.
I think the luckiest thing ever happened to this country is having a finance minister who's not a politician, but on the other hand is the world well-known economist. And he couldn't care less whether he loses the job, and he's not going to sacrifice his principles or do anything or withhold anything which is good for the country.
The first budget of the Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh team was hailed by industry as a step in the right direction. The rupee was made partially convertible. A number of measures liberated the shackles that tied Indian business, and incentives were offered to promote foreign investments.
An atmosphere has been created where people are prepared to act. In fact, the rationale of reform measures are that it creates conducive atmosphere for the major players, industry, government, people, to respond to the changing situation and act. That atmosphere has been created, and I do hope the players should take advantage of it and would act.
The concurrent boom in the stock market at first reflected an enthusiastic support for this budget, but the subsequent scam in which brokers in nexus with banks skimmed millions of rupees dampened the euphoria.
I think the stock market scam did reveal some very basic weaknesses in the financial system and also in the stock markets. Frankly, government was aware that there were these weaknesses because, as a matter of fact, we had set up the Narasimham Committee to go into reform of the financial system in 1991 precisely because of a recognition that as we move towards a more industrially dynamic economy, we needed a much stronger, more efficient financial system, and also a capital market which was much more transparent.
But it was developments in the political front which dealt a body blow to Narasimha Rao's economic recovery program. The volatile Ayodhya issue had brought things to tinderbox stage. And then, on 6th of December 1992, the unthinkable happened. The subsequent communal carnage cast a spell of gloom. There were doubts once again whether the Indian economy would survive this latest crisis. The resilience of the market was evident in the quick endorsement from industrialists and foreign investors. But then came the Bombay bomb blast. It was evident that a sinister plot was afoot to destabilize the economy itself, and what better target than create panic and attack the very financial nerve center of the country.
But I am happy to point out that the way administration, people, industry, trade and business community have responded, particularly after the incidents of Bombay, and in the quickest possible manner the normalcy was brought back, speaks a lot of things, and at least we have been able to frustrate the evil design of the saboteurs to demoralize the people.
By the end of February 1993, the new budget took the radical changes instituted in the economy further as never before. The rupee was made fully convertible in trade account, fiscal deficit controlled, and inflation brought down to almost 6%. All these changes won the approval of industrialists and foreign collaborators.
We want to move towards an economy which is more open, more competitive, and more able to interact with the world on its own terms. And I think the budget makes takes some major steps forward. The rupee, as you know, now the exchange rate is unified and the rupee is being floated. So far, it has performed very well under the new regime. The exchange rate is stable, indicating confidence both from inside and outside on the future of the economy.
Government has done an excellent job in 2 years. Especially this budget was very, very good budget, which I can say was the best budget since we got independence.
2 years down the road, and the Rao government has shown a steely resolve to its economic restructuring promise. But how far must it still go to convert intentions to purposeful action? And what is in store ahead?
Reform is not something that is achieved in 1 year. I would say that if you look at the experience of other countries, it takes 4 or 5 years for a major structural reform to be put in place. So I would expect that we would continue down this road at least for another 2 or 3 years so that we can get the full benefits of what we've set out to do.